Today we're out here with the biggest Volkswagen sold in America and my top pick for a three-row crossover if you're a family with kids still in child seats, the Volkswagen Atlas. This particular model is a 2019 Atlas, but we don't expect any major changes for 2020 because the Atlas was all new back in 2018. The only major change for 2020 that we know about is that there is going to be a two-row Atlas coming up soon, but that really won't affect the three-row model that we're looking at here. We don't expect the three-row model to get any engine changes or any major changes of options on the inside. If nothing has changed, you might be wondering, why are we taking a look at the Atlas again, since we do have a video on the 2018 Atlas? The main reason for that is that we now have a number of new competitors in this segment, and I've received a ton of emails asking us to compare this to the Telluride, the Palisade, and of course the new rear-wheel drive Ford Explorer. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Is the Atlas still the top family pick? First off, I would say yes, if you have kids in child seats. If you don't, then it becomes a little bit trickier. The Atlas is big, boxy, and square, and still instantly recognizable as a Volkswagen. A lot of the design cues are shared with Volkswagen's passenger car lineup, including this very horizontal design up front. But you can see as I'm standing next to it that the Atlas has a very tall profile as well, so we have a fairly high hood. Be sure and let me know what you think about the overall design down there in the comment section below. I have to say that I am partial to a boxy design like this, so I think that this is one of the most attractive three-row crossovers in America. I think this is better looking than the new Ford Explorer. I also think it's a little better looking than the new Hyundai Palisade as well. And I like this and the new Kia Telluride about equally for different reasons. I also think this ends up being a little bit more my taste than a Mazda CX-9. The CX-9 is unquestionably beautiful, but I prefer this sort of boxy style in an SUV. The family friendliness of the Atlas has more to do with the boxy profile, which really helps improve rear seat headroom, and child seat practicality on the inside than overall length. Because at 198.3 inches long, this is not the biggest three-row crossover in America by far. Something like a Dodge Durango is a few inches longer than this, and even a Mazda CX-9 manages to be a little bit longer than this as well. But this is almost exactly the same length as the brand new Ford Explorer. One thing worth noting is that even though this is bigger than something like a Honda Pilot or the Toyota Highlander, it does not have an 8-passenger configuration. This is a 7-seat vehicle or a 6-seat vehicle, depending on the trim level you get. 2 people up front, 3 people in the middle, and then 2 people in the back. There's also optionally a captain's chair option in the second row. As we work our way to the rear, you'll notice that we do have a little bit of a slope right here to the rear glass that does cut down on cargo practicality and third row headroom just a hair versus some of the competition, but it's still excellent in the Atlas overall. This is not quite as square in the back as something like the new Kia Telluride, but overall it definitely is more square than some of the swoopier options like the Mazda CX-9, and that's one of the keys to the practicality of the Atlas. The big and boxy profile makes these wheels look a lot smaller than they really are. These are 20-inch wheels, and they have 255 width tires on them. Base models of the Atlas come with 245 width tires, top-end models with 255s. So these are some of the wider tires that you'll find in this segment. The big and boxy theme continues out back, where we find combination tail lamp modules. That means that the brake lights and the parking lights are LEDs. Everything else is incandescent back there. We have a optional trailer hitch right here in the middle. That gives us the 5,000-pound towing capacity that this is rated for. And then we have fake exhaust tips on each side. These are well done, but they're not real. The real exhaust is tucked up under the bumper. When it comes to active safety, Volkswagen is marching to a slightly different drummer. We get forward collision warning, blind spot monitoring, and autonomous braking with pedestrian detection standard on all trims, but importantly, we don't get radar adaptive cruise control until we step up to the safety and tech package on one of the trims for about $38,000. So you won't find that particular safety feature or convenience feature, depending on how you want to look at it, until upper end trims, and we do find some of those systems standard in the competition, most notably the Highlander, the Pilot, the Telluride, the Palisade. They're all going to give you that adaptive cruise control functionality at a lower price than the Atlas. Under the hood, we find 2 very familiar Volkswagen engines. Things start out with the 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine that gives us the best fuel economy at 24 miles per gallon combined. But you'll only get 235 horsepower out of that engine when you feed it premium unleaded. Then we get this engine right here. It's a 3.6-liter Vr6 engine that's tuned for regular unleaded. So if you don't want to buy premium, you might want to get the V6. This produces 276 horsepower and 266 pound-feet of torque. Both engines are mated to 8-speed automatic transmissions, but all-wheel drive is available only with the V6. Fuel economy is definitely lower if you choose the V6, at 20 miles per gallon combined for the front-wheel drive model, 19 for the all-wheel drive model that we're driving today. You might be wondering why I called this a Vr6 engine instead of just a V6 engine. The reason is that Volkswagen loves very narrow-angled cylinder banks. So a typical V6 engine, the cylinder banks would be offset by either 60 degrees or 90 degrees depending on the design. It is considerably narrower in a Vr6 engine. You can think of this as sort of a hybrid between an inline engine and a V6 engine because it has some characteristics of both. The cylinders are not quite perfectly in a line. They're splayed by about 12 degrees or so, so that way it has some characteristics of an inline engine. It saves components on the top, makes things a little bit simpler, and it also makes it more compact. Generally speaking, the reason Volkswagen does this is because it allows them to put a V6 engine into the space that's normally reserved for an inline 4. If you choose the 4-cylinder engine, then towing comes in at 2,000 pounds maximum. If you choose the V6, then it's either 2,000 or 5,000, depending on whether or not you get the factory-installed tow hitch we saw a little bit earlier. If you get that, you get 5,000 pounds of towing capacity. If you don't, it's only rated for 2,000. I give front seat comfort in this top-end trim 9 out of 10 points. We don't have an extending thigh cushion like we see in some of the newer entries, but we do have adjustable lumbar support and a decent range of motion for the power driver's seat. We also have a tilt-telescopic steering column with a large range of motion that should make it easier for shorter and taller drivers to find a good driving position. One thing to keep in mind is that, like many non-luxury crossovers, the front passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat, so it does not have the adjustable lumbar support that I have over here. The Atlas, like the Telluride, the Palisade, and the Chevy Traverse, are about a semi-step larger than the Pilot or the Highlander, so if you're looking for a roomier second row or third row experience, this is where you want to shop. Although the Atlas may not look like it's that much larger than a Highlander, one dimension that is significantly different is the wheelbase, and that's the distance between the front wheels and the back wheels right there. You can see that the back wheels definitely affect the way that the second row seat fits in the vehicle and the way everything is arranged in here. The wheelbase in this is about 8 inches larger than the Toyota Highlander, and that definitely gives us more room, especially when we're taking a look at the front row and the second row. You can see sitting here behind myself, I have about a foot of legroom left. Now, as I said, this is either a 7 or a 6 passenger crossover. So we have the 3 across bench in the back, and then we can get optional captain's chairs if you want to cut this down to 6 passengers. Overall headroom is definitely generous back here. Even in this center seating position, I have about 1.5 inches of headroom left, and we are in the model with the optional panoramic moonroof. This second row seat is the main reason that the Atlas is so family friendly. By putting 3 people across this second row seat instead of 3 people across the third row seat, the 7 people in here are going to be more comfortable for one. Another thing Volkswagen does is they make the bench seat standard in all trims, including the very top end trim. So if you want all the gadgets and goodies that we see on this interior, and you want the bench seat, you can do that here, but you can't do that in all of the competition. Many competitors will replace the second row bench seat with captain's chairs, and you just can't get a bench seat in those top end trims. The next thing is the way this bench seat moves. If I unlatch it, you'll notice this moves in a very different fashion than most of the seats in the 3-row crossover segment. This means that you can keep child seats latched into both sides of this bench seat and still hop into the third row, up to 3 child seats across. This won't make much of a difference if your kids are in rear-facing child seats, but if they're in forward-facing child seats or boosters, this is a serious practicality improvement over every other 3-row crossover out there. The Nissan Pathfinder and the Mazda CX-9 will allow you to keep a child seat latched into place in this same fashion, but only on this seat that I'm sitting in right here, the 40% side on the passenger side of the vehicle. The Atlas is the only 3-row crossover at the moment that will let you do this to both sides of the rear bench. And it's worth noting that even though the Telluride and Palisade are big, comfortable crossovers that are designed for families, you cannot keep a child seat latched into place in any of those seats and tilt and slide them forward in this same fashion. Now on the downside, the second row seat, especially the 60% side, is pretty heavy, so it does require a little bit more effort to move these seats around than some of the competition seats. That may be a bit of a problem if kids are going to be in the third row. Thanks to this tilt and slide mechanism, hopping into the third row is definitely easier than in most of the 3-row competition, again, if we have that child seat latched into place. We can then pull this all the way back and then return that second row seat to its original position. Once the second row seat is latched into place, we definitely find one of the most comfortable third rows outside of a minivan in America. Now, we don't have as much legroom back here as we find in the Telluride or the Palisade. That is really obvious because my knee is digging into this seat back. However, I had so much legroom in the second row, I could move the second row seat forward and make it more comfortable for a taller adult in the back. When it comes to overall headroom, my head is touching the ceiling, and this headrest does hit me in kind of an unusual place in the back, but again, remember that we are talking about fairly compact third rows, and these are usually reserved for naughty children or mother-in-laws. If you're looking for the most accommodating third row in this segment, that really would be something along the lines of the Telluride because we get so much legroom in that interior. We also have interior trappings that are a little bit more premium back here in the third row. But getting into that third row with child seats in the second row, that's going to be a lot trickier in the Telluride. At just over 20 cubic feet of storage space behind the third row, this is one of the largest cargo areas you can get in a three-row crossover in America. This is a little bit behind the Traverse at 23 cubic feet and the Telluride at 21, but it's right in the same range. And we were able to fit several 24-inch roller bags behind this third row because of the generous dimensions. Total of 4 right back here. Most three-row crossover owners are going to spend most of their time with the third row folded, and if you do that, then the cargo area definitely expands, and we were able to fit 8 of those 24-inch roller bags right back here. It's worth noting that although this cargo area seems cavernous, it is not as wide as the Explorer or the Telluride. That means you can't fit 4x sheet goods back here. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the very top end trim, so there are obviously options in here that we don't find on the base model. This trim has a large panoramic moonroof that goes from the front passengers' heads to just over the second row passengers' heads, but unlike some of the crossovers out there, we don't have a separate pane for the third row. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. The upholstery in this top end trim is perforated. The front seats are both heated and ventilated, and then we get heated second row seats. It's worth noting that the second row seats don't offer optional ventilation like we do see in the new Telluride and Palisade. Overall front door styling is very similar to the Passat. We have a little bit more hard plastic going on here than we find in some of the competition. For instance, the bulk of this ivory trim around the door is hard, except for this one insert right there above the armrest, and then that small armrest panel itself. The model that we're driving has the optional Fender audio system, and as we move on over to the dashboard, you can see that we have imitation wood trim all the way around in this cabin. As far as imitation wood trim goes, this is not quite as believable as some of the newer crossovers out there, but I think overall I like the look. In the center of the dash, there's a storage area above the infotainment screen. We have 2 large air vents, and then the touchscreen system itself. The system features Android Auto and Apple CarPlay integration, and this is the same software version that we've seen from Volkswagen for a while. It's not quite as easy to use as some of the newer systems out there, but I think it's more visually interesting than what we see in the new Ford Explorer. The model that we're driving has the full LCD instrument cluster, and for some reason you control what is seen on that display right here via the infotainment screen rather than the instrument cluster itself. So if you want to see distance to your destination, fuel economy, acceleration on the right or left side, you would scroll through those options right here. Continuing below that, we find a storage area with no lid. This is where we find the USB input for the system, an auxiliary input, and a 12-volt power port. There's definitely enough room to put those larger smartphones in there. And then we have a pretty traditional console shifter back here. Drive all the way back, we toggle for sport and drive right like that. Push to the right for manual mode, push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. There are then 2 large cup holders to the right of that, and then we have the engine start-stop button and the drive mode button. This allows us to toggle between snow mode, normal mode, off-road, and then we have an off-road custom mode. We can also toggle through the modes via this button right here and then control them on the screen. Below that, we have a button for the 360-degree camera system and parking sensors, and an autonomous parking button. Then there's an electric parking brake over here on the left. The center armrest is softly padded, and it opens to reveal a pretty large storage compartment, although it's not terribly deep. You might be able to fit a gallon of milk on its side, but you wouldn't be able to stand one up in there. Volkswagen is one of the few mainstream car companies that's giving us full LCD instrument clusters in a wide variety of different models. You can get them here in the Atlas. You can also, interestingly enough, get them in something like a Volkswagen Jetta. This display may look very similar to what we see in current generation Audi products, but it doesn't have the same kind of wow factor that we find in the Audis, and it's also not quite as snappy, so I think they're using different processors and different hardware behind there. We do have the ability to get a full screen map view right like that, but we don't find Google satellite imagery like we find in the Audi lineup. You can choose what you see in those different quadrants. Again, you adjust what's in the right and the left-hand dial via the infotainment system. And then in the middle, we can choose between a wide variety of different features, including that map display, vehicle status, our typical trip computer readouts, assist system, etc. The steering wheel is a pretty familiar Volkswagen design with a split bottom spoke. There are no paddle shifters on the back, but we do have some sport grips up top. Volkswagen divorces the infotainment button, so we find volume up and down on the left, and then track forward, backward over here on the right. These controls relate to that multifunction LCD, so we can change the view with that button right there, toggle around options with the up and down button, and then change options in the middle with these side-to-side toggles, and then OK. We then have a voice command button, and then the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system. In our acceleration tests, the Atlas went from 0 to 60 in 7.4 seconds, putting this right in the middle of things for the three-row crossover segment. In our braking test, this model took 124 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That surprised me a little bit because the overall curb weight is not terribly high, and we have 255 with tires on this model. I think a lot of that has to do with the level of grip that these tires provide. They are a little bit focused on overall fuel economy, and that means they're not quite as grippy. You could definitely improve the overall handling and overall stopping distance of the Atlas if you put grippier summer tires on this. But of course, doing so would adversely affect the fuel economy, and that's why Volkswagen doesn't do that from the factory. When it comes to overall handling, the Atlas does fairly well, just as you'd expect out of a modern Volkswagen. This doesn't have the same sort of steering feel that we see in the new Ford Explorer or in the Mazda CX-9, but it has definitely more grip than you'd find in something like a Toyota Highlander. You can thank the relatively decent curb weight for that and the wide tires. Volkswagen also does a really good job at sitting on the fence when it comes to tuning the suspension, giving us a very good balance between overall ride and overall handling ability. Now, don't take that to mean that the Atlas handles like a compact crossover, because it just doesn't. This is still a big three-row vehicle. But as far as large three-row crossovers go, the Atlas is relatively fun to drive. As you'd expect out of a big Volkswagen that's designed for hauling families, the suspension is relatively compliant, even when we get out on a rougher road like the gravel road that we're on here. Overall, the suspension tune is not quite as soft as a Pathfinder, but it's definitely softer than something like a Jetta or even a Volkswagen Tiguan. Therefore, when it comes to our overall ride score, I'm going to give this model and all versions of the Atlas an A. Back out on the paved road, the suspension tune is definitely comfortable, but it doesn't feel ponderous like some large SUVs can, even though we have more room on the inside and a little bit more cargo room in the back as well than something like a Chevy Tahoe. Despite the fact that we have 255 with tires on this top end trim and a very blocky design, the cabin is pretty quiet, which is very impressive. At 50 miles an hour in our cabin noise test, we scored 70 decibels in here, making this one of the quieter three-row crossovers in the mainstream segment. If you want something quieter than this, you'll have to look at something like a luxury crossover. The one fly in the ointment for the Atlas appears to be fuel economy. We've been averaging 18.3 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. That's about 1 mile per gallon below the EPA estimate. But even if this vehicle was getting 19 miles per gallon average, that would still be below some of the newer entries in the segment, like the Telluride, the Palisade, and of course the Ford Explorer. The base engine in the Explorer for 2020 is a 2.3-liter turbocharged four-cylinder engine. It gives us 300 horsepower, takes that vehicle from 0 to 60 1 second faster than this, and appears to be getting better fuel economy than this in most folks' real-world driving tests so far. Now, we haven't had that Explorer at home to do our complete weekly review on it just yet, so stay tuned for that fuel economy average, but we have had the Telluride, and the Telluride did do better than this in terms of overall fuel economy, and fuel economy hasn't exactly been Kia's forte in the past. Overall, the Atlas is a very easy to live with crossover. It's quiet, it's comfortable, it handles well. Overall acceleration is pretty average for this segment, and handling and braking ability could definitely be improved by swapping out some grippier tires if you wanted to do that, if that was something that you were interested in, because we already have fairly wide tires for a three-row crossover. A lot of crossovers in this segment make do with 225 or 235 width tires, and we have 255s on the top end trims and 245s even on the base model. If you're looking for the fastest and most exciting entry in the segment, that's not going to be the Atlas. But if you're looking for a vehicle that's going to integrate well in your daily routine, that's definitely going to be this. For 2019, the Atlas starts at $30,895. That gets you the S trim and the 2-liter turbocharged engine with front-wheel drive. All-wheel drive is available in that base model, but it causes you to step up into the V6, and that's why we see such a large price jump between the front-wheel drive S trim and the all-wheel drive S trim. It gets all-wheel drive and the V6. When you take a look at the rest of the pricing lineup on your screen, all of the other trims are going to get the V6 as standard equipment, so it's just that base model that gets the 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo. Most shoppers are likely going to want at least the SE trim, because that gets you many of the features that you'd expect in a 3-row crossover, like the 3-zone climate control, the keyless entry and go, the easier to clean leatherette seats. That seems to be a pretty big deal in this segment, especially if you have kids back there. Power driver seat, heated front seats, rear sunshades, the upgraded audio, and the 8-inch infotainment system that we had in our model. It's worth noting that you have to step further up the ladder, however, if you want certain key features that we saw in this video. For instance, if you want the power liftgate, that'll set you back at least $37,295. If you want the digital LCD cockpit that we saw in this model, it's the digital instrument cluster, that's going to be at least $41,395. And if you want real leather in your Atlas, you have to go all the way up to the very top end trim in order to get that real cow, and that is $48,395. That's significantly more expensive than getting leather in any of the other competitive options out there. Speaking of comparisons, let's just dive right on into that now. Let's first talk about the most competitive three-row crossovers to the Atlas, the all-new Telluride and the all-new Palisade. Hyundai and Kia are probably not terribly happy with me that I'm lumping these two models together for the same comparison, but there's some logical reason for that. They share an awful lot under the skin. Now, on the surface, styling is definitely different between the two. The Telluride is more upright, it's more boxy, it is a little bit more practical as a result of that. The Palisade is going for a slightly more luxurious look. But under the skin, the Telluride and the Palisade share suspensions, engines, transmissions, etc. So they're very, very comparable. And the price range of the two vehicles is very similar as well. They go from right around $31,500 up to just over $46,000 plus destination. The Kia and the Hyundai start a little bit more expensive than the Volkswagen, but you get the V6 engine standard rather than having to option up into that. By the time you add all-wheel drive, the Hyundai and the Kia are going to be less expensive. Now, Volkswagen has an unusually long warranty for a mainstream brand, and they have a very long bumper-to-bumper warranty, so depending on exactly what warranty portion you're looking at, there are pros and cons on both sides there. The other big reason to buy the Telluride or the Palisade would be overall interior room. We get an awful lot more legroom in both of those crossovers than we get in the Atlas. So if you have a family with people with long legs, they're definitely going to fit in the Hyundai or the Kia a little bit more comfortably. We also get a teeny tiny bit more cargo room in the back and a slightly wider cargo area back there. But on the downside, they're not as child seat friendly as the Atlas. So if you have kids in booster seats or forward-facing seats, it's going to be a lot easier for folks to get into the third row in the Atlas than in either of those other options. If you're a family that has just one child in a child seat, that may not be a huge deal. But if you're a family that has one kid in a child seat and one in a booster seat, then this is going to be an important consideration. As far as overall value goes, both the Telluride and the Palisade provide excellent value here. And depending on exactly how you have these vehicles configured, they're going to be $2,000 to $4,000 less expensive than a comparably equipped Volkswagen Atlas. Again, it depends on exactly how you want to arrange those features. But we do see excellent value in both of those options. Really, the big difference between the Telluride and the Palisade is styling and personal preference. With that out of the way, let's move on to the Toyota Highlander. The most important thing to know about the Highlander is that we're getting an all-new model for 2020. So if you're looking for a great deal on a Highlander right now, you'll probably find one closer to the end of 2019. If you're looking for the brand new Highlander, you'll probably have to wait until December or possibly January of 2020 to get your hands on one. Toyota tells us that they've made the Highlander a little bit bigger for 2020 to give us a little bit more storage space behind the third row, but it's still not going to be as generous as what we see in the Atlas, and the third row seats definitely appear to be a little bit smaller than what we see in the Volkswagen as well. Instead of focusing on interior roominess, Toyota is doubling down on what people have liked about the Highlander. The practicality of the overall size vehicle. It's definitely easier to park than some of the larger crossovers in this segment. They seem to be doubling down on overall luxury and definitely on overall fuel economy. As with the Hyundai and the Kia, however, the Toyota is less child seat friendly. You can't leave child seats latched into that second row and gain easy access to the third row. That's even more critical in a vehicle that's the size of the Highlander, or of course something like a Honda Pilot, because the car overall is a little bit smaller, so the quarters are a little bit more cramped. There's not quite as much room to try and climb behind that second row seat to get into the third row seat if there's a child seat in place. Next up, we have the all-new 2020 Ford Explorer. We do have a first drive review on this vehicle already. We will have a full review coming up just as soon as possible. The most important thing to know about the Explorer is that it has gone all in on rear-wheel drive. That makes the packaging overall a little bit less efficient than the last generation Explorer, but it does mean that it's an awful lot more fun to drive. It also gives us some of the best performance figures for a base engine in this segment, around 6.5 seconds 0 to 60, even in the absolute base trim. Absolutely incredible performance in that model. We also get excellent fuel economy thanks to a standard 10-speed automatic transmission and their standard 2.3-liter turbo. Although the Explorer is packaged a little bit less efficiently than the last generation Explorer, it ends up being a little bit larger on the inside than you might think. Compared to the Atlas, which is very boxy, the Atlas feels bigger, but when you really start taking a look at the numbers, you'll notice that the Explorer is just about the same size, although it does have a slightly smaller cargo area as a result of the transition to rear-wheel drive. We have very similar overall headroom, legroom figures, etc. One key advantage that the Explorer does have over the Atlas, however, is a slightly wider cargo area, so you could put larger items right there into the vehicle, 4x8 sheets of plywood would still hang out of the back, but you could put those larger craft items in there if you really had to do that in a pinch. As with the rest of the competition, however, it's less child seat friendly. You just can't leave a child seat latched into the second row and gain easy access to the third row. By all indications, it's also going to be more expensive. We don't have the base model available yet in America, but even when that base model comes, it's not going to have the same kind of value that we find in the base Atlas. It's probably going to be a little bit more expensive as well. Until that base model becomes available, the least expensive Explorer for 2020 will be at least $36,675, so nearly $6,000 more than the base model of the Atlas. Is the extra fun factor and extra performance worth that $6,000 upgrade? I'll leave that decision to you. Next up, we have the Chevy Traverse. The Traverse is pretty big. It's 6 inches longer overall than the Atlas. It's not quite as boxy, however, and as a result, it doesn't end up feeling that much roomier on the inside. Overall legroom and headroom figures are very similar to the Atlas, even though it is notably larger. It is going to be a little bit harder to park as a result. Now, we do get 2 cubic feet more cargo space in the back, and that does mean you can probably fit a little bit more luggage back there, but not too much more. None of these 3-row crossovers really will be able to carry 3 rows of passengers and 3 rows of passengers' luggage in the back. Although a little bit less efficient in terms of overall packaging, Chevy has been very aggressive when it comes to overall pricing, and it manages to beat the Atlas in terms of base price, coming in at $29,930. That base price also gets you the 9-speed automatic transmission and the V6 engine, so they're not sticking an older engine or older transmission in that base model. That easily makes the Traverse one of the best base model values in this segment. Now, you're not going to have all the same kind of features in that absolute base model of the Traverse that we find in the competition. Chevy has been pretty efficient at picking out all sorts of features in that model to drive that price as low as possible, but you will be able to get into it for right around $30,000. It's also likely that Chevy is going to give you a little bit more cash on the hood of that Traverse than we see on the Atlas, driving that price even lower. Now, if you get carried away with features and options, you can get your Chevy Traverse up over $51,000, so be sure and keep your option shopping under control. The last thing to know about the Traverse is that, like the rest of the 3-row competition we've discussed so far, you can't leave a child seat latched into the second row. Aside from that, the story is going to be basically the same, whether we're talking about a Dodge Durango or a Honda Pilot or any of the other entries in this particular segment. That brings us along to our top picks. The 2-row and 3-row crossover segments in America are hotly competitive right now, and as a result, we have a ton of very interesting options here, depending on exactly what you're looking for in your next vehicle. If you're looking for the best base model value, that would either be the Chevy Traverse or the Subaru Ascent. Chevy Traverse for the front-wheel drive, absolute stripped-down base model. It's really a good deal if you want a big crossover. The Ascent's a great deal if you're looking for something with a little bit more feature content and standard all-wheel drive with excellent fuel economy. It's very well-rounded down there at the bottom of its pricing structure. If you're looking for the best towing option, as we've said before, that is easily hands down the Dodge Durango. Towing capacities will definitely exceed even full-size body-on-frame SUVs out there like a Chevy Tahoe, and you can do that in a crossover that is sized a little bit more like a Traverse. So definitely a little bit easier to park than those body-on-frame SUVs, and a little bit more pleasing and less expensive to drive as well. Without a doubt, the Volkswagen Atlas wins the award for the most family-friendly 3-row crossover in America. It also does very well when it comes to our overall score as far as top picks in this segment, but I think that the Telluride and the Palisade both beat it out for the best well-rounded crossover in America. Exactly which one of those is right for you really depends on your particular preference when it comes to overall styling. I think that the Kia Telluride is a little bit more my preference. The front-end look in the Palisade is not quite my cup of tea, but let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. And let me know what you would pick if you were shopping in this segment, especially if you have 1 or 2 children still in child seats. Is that child seat functionality in the Volkswagen Atlas a deal changer for you? Would it make you choose that over some of the competition that would either be a little bit less expensive or a little bit more fun to drive? Or are you looking in the long game? Are you thinking my kids are going to be out of child seats, so that's not as critical of a feature for me? Let me know all of that down there in the comment section below. Also find us over at facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what we're driving this week. You can also click up there to the top of your screen if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do. I'll see you later.